You're in the rant wormhole where I rant about whatever it is my $5 a month patrons tell me to rant about. This rant is for Calliope, to which he tells me to rant about how Reddit upvotes Tiananmen Square to the front page every single day. I don't really know if Reddit does that. I almost never use Reddit. I only really follow some of the political boards to like find links to news articles and stuff. I don't follow Reddit. I think the majority of the people on Reddit are completely cancerous, and I think the website as a whole is cancerous. But I want to talk a little bit about the whole Tiananmen Square thing in general because there's a lot of very, very common Western lies which have been proven to be lies at this point by a number of scholars and even United States Embassy staff to China at the time. Yeah, the Chinese version of the story is closer to the truth. You know, we've seen footage of violent mobs of people, you know, killing soldiers and lighting things on fire, blowing things up, people in tanks and things like that. Western media never talks about those people, never talk about the violence and the horrendous things that those people did, never says a word about it. It's always Chinese government does this and that, you know, terrible things, 100 billion million killed and things like that. Well, the actual number is closer to 200. And a lot of the deaths, a lot of the deaths that took place on both sides, not just of citizens, but also of a lot of people combating them as well, did not take place in Tiananmen Square at all. In fact, there was no massacre inside of Tiananmen Square. The common narrative that we receive inside of the US and the West in general is, you know, images of people fighting and you know, lunging bombs against each other and stuff inside of Tiananmen Square never happened. This footage that you tend to see took place, you know, yards and yards away from it. You know, not even in Tiananmen Square itself. And so I think it's an interesting case because there are just a lot of really weird lies that were told through the media that are easily disprovable, that people tend to believe anyway, just because that's what was reported on the news at the time, you know, the news that's owned by the capitalist class and subsequently the capitalist class that controls the state media, which wants China out of the picture in the first place. And so, you know, when you look at it in the context of, you know, what Chomsky called manufacturing consent, the fact that, you know, when you have these mega corporations controlling the government, and therefore the interests of the government are being placed in these mega corporations who also control the media, you begin to see that the threads of truth that were being sown about the Tiananmen Square narrative are slowly being cut. They're no longer as visible as they were before because every single motivation that they could have to distort the truth and to tell you that it's a totalitarian act of brutality on every single level is there. And so they're going to use footage from places that are not even Tiananmen Square to attempt to tell you that it is Tiananmen Square that's you know being shot up and rioted in. Another thing that they often don't tell you is that I think at least one of the reasons why the you know the revolution had failed at that moment, the reason why they didn't really make any ground wasn't because of the brutality of the police or the military at the time. It was because the people who were protesting were on two very different sides. On the one end, you had, you know, the teachers and the very blue collar working class people who were Maoists, and they were protesting against the frankly kind of reactionary government of Deng Xiaoping. You know, very obviously revisionist. You know, making a lot of sweeping reforms to the economy that led to a lot of, you know, people in worse conditions economically. You know, it grew the country as a whole over time, but when these reforms were made, there were a lot of very drastic things that happened to the Chinese people as a result of, bringing capitalism to the country. And so, you had these groups of people who benefited greatly from things like the Cultural Revolution, from, the Mao Zedong era in general, and they were saying, hey, you need to stop this. These capitalistic reforms are not what our society is about, and these are the things that we tried to seek to run away from. These were the things that, destroyed our country, that, had hundreds of years of famines and famines and famines in our country. Under socialism, we were able to raise the life expectancy faster than any country in the world ever has. We guaranteed healthcare to all of these people. We had semi-autonomous regions where, people didn't even necessarily have to use currency in these smaller places where, the working class people were thriving and able to lift themselves out of poverty. This was what, the Mao Zedong era was about. Exiting from a feudalist, impoverished, nation that had all of these, constant problems with farming and of drought and flooding and these types of things that you saw, before the communists took power and obviously a bit after, these very, very big famines that you would see in the feudalist era. And, as they developed the country under Mao, you saw these people drastically have their living standard raised faster than any economy in the entire world, in the entire history of the world. And so you saw these teachers, these blue collar workers coming out and protesting in Tiananmen Square, around Tiananmen Square, saying, we need to return to Mao. But then on the other end, you had these people largely funded by the United States and other liberal, revisionist, opportunist groups, anarchists in there and so on, liberals, those types of people. And you saw them in there saying, the U.S. is great and we need freedom and all this other absolute nonsense. And one of the main reasons why I think they failed to get anything across was because the two sides did not have, they did not have alliances with one another. They were protesting, sure, but they didn't protest similar things. You had these very much postmodernist, new left, color revolution types of people, alongside these liberal reformists, and then on the other end you had genuine Maoists. And so the dynamics within the Tiananmen Square protests were very, very different than what the Western media would tend to tell you. Because the only thing they're going to tell you is that there was a ginormous massacre, lots and lots of people killed, and, bombs going off and all this other nonsense. And then tie it in with they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting against evil, deadly socialism that killed 100 bajillion, billion, million people, when it's simply not true. The socialism raised these people out of poverty. Things like the Cultural Revolution greatly benefited the lives of the Chinese people. And in the protests, we saw that many of those people who their lives benefited from socialism were out there protesting against the revisionist government of Deng Xiaoping. And so I think those are the things that are really important to look at when you talk about Tiananmen Square, because the narrative that the Western media gives you is just wrong. Like, factually, on its basis, any evidence that you could possibly construe to be the truth is there. That, like, one or two Google searches is going to lead you to seeing that this just isn't true. And even if the majority of the lies touted about Tiananmen Square were true, that these were all just peaceful guys running around here to definitely not kill policemen in the streets, and to not have some kind of violent revolution, you can understand the actions taken by the government, because this was happening at the time that all of these socialist governments around the world were falling. They were ending, and then you saw massive amounts of poverty occurring in all of the countries that fell, where socialism was once bringing prosperous nations out of poverty. You saw the United States, and their Western allies funding insurgencies, funding CIA-backed rebel groups in these countries in order to end socialism within them. And so, of course, the government of China is going to be a little bit scared about these protesters coming out here and saying we need to change the regime entirely. I could understand why they would take the actions that they did in an instance like that, because it would be a time where preserving the sovereignty of your nation against international pressure would become one of the most important things. But even with that in mind, you cannot deny the factual reality that these people were quite literally terrorists who were going out here trying to create a new government, trying to attack police officers and cause an insurgency. And I think once that fact is put into place, once the actual numbers are put into place, the fact that the numbers are really quite small, and the fact that they even had to lie about where the killings took place in the first place in the Western media, I think all signs seem to point to this entire story being a hoax. And it really is sad to me that to this day, this propaganda is so prevalent within our culture that people are making Tiananmen Square memes and stuff saying that, oh, China, big evil guys did terrible thing. If you look at what actually happened, it's not anywhere close to the narrative that you're given by the media. Do I think it was bad that it happened? Absolutely. Do I think there were mistakes that occurred on the behalf of the Chinese government? Of course. But when you look at the violence that these people were taking out, and when you look at the fact that they had to respond fairly quickly, I can understand why it is that the Chinese government may have made some marginal errors in how they reacted to the situation. But ultimately, the fact is that these were violent people trying to cause an uprising in a year of uprisings all over the world, in a year of vicious imperialism being taken place by these CIA-backed groups that ultimately led to the fall of the national sovereignty of these nations and their independence. And so it's just a thought. Thank you to Calliope for the $5.